thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me to be here today. I feel very privileged to be among so many inspirational women, so thank you very much. I wanted to start today, so I am a scientist, but a social scientist, and a lot of the work that I've been involved in has been around the topic of violence against women and gender-based violence. And whilst I'm speaking from a very Scottish perspective, I do know that sadly the topic of violence against women spans the global world. Okay, so a lot of the things I talk about today are based in Scotland but are applicable worldwide. So to begin, I just wanted to show some of the projects that I've been involved in during my time as an academic. For me, I am a feminist, and the personal is very much the political. So that was a mantra used by a lot of second wave feminists to talk about how the personal issues of women are very much the larger political issues. So today I sat at the table and spoke to a professor of genetics, and we were talking about the fact that we have children. So that is a personal thing to us, but it's also a political thing, having to organise childcare in Scotland so I can come across to India. So these are things that involve women, those political decisions that engage our personal lives. So some of the work that I've been involved in is specifically to do with violence against women and young people's understandings of violence against women, which I'm going to speak about more in a moment. I've also worked with the Scottish Government to engage their legislation around domestic abuse, and also in terms of the sentencing that domestic abuse offenders receive if they end up in court, which sadly in Scotland, and I'm sure across the world, isn't very often. Because I'm talking about violence and domestic abuse, I just want to make people aware that I am conscious that it can be quite a distressing subject, so I'm just flagging that before I begin. So that's me in not so sunny Scotland, and looking at my contribution to work. When I was told that I'd been nominated for an award, I thought about the contribution that I'd made to the field that I'm in, and I'm very proud that I started not at a university but within a refuge. So I worked with women who'd experienced violence for quite a few years before I went on to study, before I worked for my PhD and went into academia. And I think as women we need to recognise that often it's the work that we do before we enter university, before we study, that is equally as important but often is not recognised. So today I'm going to speak about my involvement in the Violence Against Women movement, my contribution to scholarship around gender and violence, and this has taken a number of forms. So how we understand gender is really important to how we understand violence against women. I'm also going to talk about the specific case of Scotland and the influence that feminism has had on creating the laws in Scotland, and something that we are very proud of in Scotland. I've also done work on how the media frames domestic abuse, how it can often blame women for the violence that they experience. And whilst I'm not going to talk about that today, I'm happy to talk about that to anybody that's interested. I also want to talk about the role of the criminal justice system in Scotland and how it engages with women who've experienced violence against women. So gender is a social construction that prescribes gendered behaviours, responsibilities and expectations that inform how men and women are meant to be. It's important to define gender and what it means when we talk about gender. So gender refers not only to being a man or a woman, but it's those relations between them and those expectations that we have upon men and upon women. And the way that gender is ordered in society privileges certain genders and privileges certain men. So when we look at violence, violence can take many forms. It can be legally sanctioned or condemned with various intentions or motives. It is powerful, political, it can be accidental, it can be the result of repercussions or retaliation. Violence can involve a myriad of behaviours and a multitude of consequences. This can inform physical injuries, emotional abuses, personal and sexual violations, or material deprivations. So in my work, I make the argument that violence is gendered. So according to the Istanbul Convention, gender-based violence is a manifestation of historically unequal power relations between women and men, which have led to the domination over and discrimination against women by men, and to the prevention of the full advancement of women. And we heard that in the address today. Women are prevented from reaching their full capacity, their full potential, and part of the reason for that is because of violence against women. So violence against women prevents women from reaching their full potential, but it's also because women are still unequal in society that violence against women occurs. So this is Scotland. You're all very welcome to join and to come along. It's very cold, but it's very beautiful. Scotland is one of the 4 countries that make up the United Kingdom. So when people talk about England, they think that they're talking about the United Kingdom, but Scotland is very different from England. It has different laws and responsibilities, and it has devolved powers, meaning that it's in charge of most of its own laws and legislation. And so for people who live there, we'd say it's probably more liberal than the rest of the United Kingdom. Okay, and people have more of a say with what happens with the government, which I'll talk about in terms of the laws in a moment. So back in the year 2000, 1999, Scotland received its devolved powers. So it was a devolved country and wanted to change a lot of the laws and legislation. One of the things it wanted to do differently from the rest of the United Kingdom was have a gendered definition of domestic abuse. So currently, in the rest of the United Kingdom, domestic abuse just talks about men and women as victims. But Scotland wanted to recognise the significant victimisation of women by men, and the fact that more women were subject to abuse within the home than men, and also recognise that whilst men could be victims of violence, they were more likely to be victimised by other men than by their wives. And so this was quite radical back in 2000. And I was involved in a research project that looked at this justification of the gendered definition of domestic abuse. And what we did, we talked to men who had said, within a crime survey. So we have a crime survey that goes out within the United Kingdom every 3 or 4 years. And a number of men had said that they had experienced domestic abuse. So as researchers, we went and spoke to these men. There were 30 men who said that they had experienced domestic abuse from their wives or their partners. So we interviewed these men. And what we found was that whilst the men had experienced examples of violence, often these examples of violence were women retaliating for the violence that they'd experienced themselves. So one of the men I interviewed said that his wife had scratched all down his face. And so I spoke to him and said, can you tell me a bit more about that injury? And he said, I had my hands around her throat and she scratched my face. So that incident tells us who was the victim. Okay? So the woman was protecting herself. She might have caused an injury to her husband, but she was being strangled, she was being choked. And the majority of these 30 men who said that they'd experienced abuse, that was the case. They were victimising their partners and had experienced a physical response to that. There were other men who said that they'd experienced domestic abuse, but by that they meant they'd had a fight or something had happened within their home, but it wasn't necessarily from their wives. So they might have had something stolen, they might have had a physical altercation with a male neighbour. So again, we can see that doesn't fit that confine of domestic abuse. So the Scottish Government, when we presented these findings, realised that actually these men weren't victims of domestic abuse, but more often than not, perpetrators. And the research that we published here